In the 3 weeks that the government has been shut down, we've talked about a lot of things that surrounded the shutdown itself. We've talked about the wall, we've talked about funding the wall, we've talked about the ideas going back and forth between the two chambers, we've talked about continuing resolutions that have died in both chambers of Congress, we've talked about legal challenges, and we've talked about just about everything under the sun for it. But one thing we haven't talked about is the emergency power that was granted to the president in the Congress of 1976, in which he can use presidential power to direct unallocated funds from the Department of Defense in order to fund and build the border wall. Well, this has only been a major news story for the last week and a half or so. This has actually been going around and being talked about since before the government shutdown. In fact, it's been talked about from the moment that the rumors started circulating about the government shutting down. People have been talking about the fact that this law gave the president the power to do so, and the MAGA faithful have been perpetuating the idea and trying to get more people on board, accosting anybody who would stand against it. But let's take a second and talk about what this means and what this could mean going forward, and even where it came from. I have linked in the description below the YouTube link to the Rush Limbaugh show from December 21st. In this episode, Rush talked about the fact that this may not be able to get done legislatively and we may need to look at other options. It was Rush who proposed the idea that we use the emergency powers to take some of the unallocated funds from the Department of Defense and use them in order to fund the border wall, declaring this a state of national emergency. Now, there have been rumors among the mainstream left who believe that it was Rush who gave Trump the idea to do so, Trump having nothing better to do than to listen to the Rush Limbaugh show and find ways to run his administration, but I don't necessarily believe that's 100% true. I do believe there is a chance that an advisor to President Trump was listening to Limbaugh on his way to work one day and got the idea and researched it to see if it was feasible and legal and came to the conclusion it was and then put the quarter into Trump's ear to do so. But I don't think it was a direct correlation between Trump and Limbaugh to do so. In spite of this, Trump's base was very quick to jump to the idea to find a way to get the wall built without having to go through the channels of Congress. Trump's base, of course, coming out and putting up a GoFundMe saying that the American people want the wall so bad that they are willing to take money out of their own pockets to pay for it themselves. The GoFundMe is still going strong and still collecting money at the time. But for the most part, the Trump faithful base is saying that it is the only way, and that Democrats have no plans to budge lest they be primaried the next time around for giving in and giving the president a win. When we start thinking about this methodology of getting our border secured and fulfilling a campaign promise, the first thing we need to realize is the fact that Rush Limbaugh is right, and so is the advisor that presumably gave the idea to Trump. Under all avenues, this is something that is perfectly legal under the Constitution and laws. Article 2 of the Constitution gives the President the absolute authority as to who comes into the country and who doesn't. When we start looking at this methodology for funding the border wall and keeping a campaign promise, one of the first things we need to look at is the fact that this is perfectly legal. Article 2 of the Constitution grants the President the absolute authority to regulate immigration and who comes into the country and who is not allowed to. This is not a legislative thing, this is executive power. Furthermore, the Congress of 1976 passed the National Emergencies Act, which does give the President the ability to appropriate funding in a hurry in case there is some sort of national emergency, such as a terror attack or an enemy army landing on our shores. The language is vague, and it does give the President the authority to declare a national emergency on many other things, but the intent of the text was in order for the President to keep the American people safe in the event that something happens before the Congress has the ability to convene and pass the proper appropriations. While this is perfectly legal, one of the first thoughts that came through my head as soon as I heard about this methodology was the idea that This would be a completely different story if it was Hillary Clinton that was proposing this in order to promote a Medicare for all agenda, a tuition for all agenda, or some sort of climate change legislation that she couldn't get through a Republican-controlled Congress. It occurs to me that the same people who have been supporting the president and saying that this is the only way to do so, and it's right and it's legal and they want him to do it, would be calling for impeachment at the least. One of the biggest obstacles to all of this is probably one of the most obvious that's out there. This is something that would be predicated on Trump opening the government back up. It would be a compromise with the Democrats, and he would still manage to get his wall. Plus, he would get the government back open up. But the problem lies in the judges that are still on many of the federal courts out there, including the Ninth Circuit Court. I almost guarantee that if the emergency power were to be declared and Trump started appropriating the funds from the Department of Defense that were unallocated, the Ninth Circuit Court already has a decision written up, or at least a case written up to hear and make the decision that would block it. In that event, until they at least were able to reword everything in order to get the appropriation done, that would hand a major win to Nancy Pelosi. Pelosi would get the government opened back up as she has been demanding without lifting a finger to try and compromise and go back the other way and get the wall built, and Trump would be stalled on his ability to appropriate funding to get the wall built. This would not be a win for Trump, and this would be a major win for Pelosi and her anti-Trump agenda. And I've heard other pundits talk about the same thing. The Ninth Circuit Court, or some other court across the country that's friendly to Pelosi's agenda, is already sitting out there and waiting to block this at a moment's notice. But there's been one other obstacle to this that I think needs to be considered that I haven't really heard any other pundit talking about. The wording of the National Emergencies Act is a little bit vague, I will admit, and that's why people out there believe that the president can use this act to go out and appropriate funding from the Department of Defense in order to build his wall. But that opens the door for down the road, and I don't think a lot of people are looking at the big picture when they think about this. In an episode that aired after the government shut down, Limbaugh cited the fact that the National Emergencies Act did come up after Watergate, and he cited the idea of the fact that after Watergate, congressional Democrats believed that there would never be a Republican president again. Therefore, they could put a law into place that would grant the president that would always be on their side all of this power, and they would never have to worry about it falling into the hands of their opponents again. And that's something that we also have to think about now if we allow our president to use this act in a way that's not really prescribed in the language of the act. A lot of the Trump faithful right now believe that there's never going to be another Democrat president again. And I'm going to come right out and say that that is absolutely wrong. There's going to be another left-leaning president in our lifetimes. Whether this fictitious future president is a neoliberal or a super progressive or even a left-leaning centrist, if we allow our current sitting president to use this method, it sets a precedent for the next people who come into office, and they can do the same thing with the same kind of funding to push their progressive agendas in much the same way. And then we will be having this discussion from the opposite side, and we'll be discussing the same thing I talked about earlier. What would we do if Hillary was doing this same thing? According to the New York Times, at this time, the president is backing off the idea of using the emergency powers in order to push his agenda, and I do think that is the best idea. And many congressional Republicans are starting to feel the same way. While we know that any Democrat who votes to allow the funding to get out there for the wall is going to be primaried, therefore they have very little incentive to reach across the aisle, the pressure is mounting against them, and there are a lot of people out there who are trying to defend them because the pressure is mounting against them to get this done and possibly cede some ground to the president in order to come up with a compromise that allows the federal workers to start getting paid and prevents them from going back out to the private sector, which is begging to have more bodies in it. I want to see the wall built the same as the next right-leaning person, but I understand the fact that it does need to be done the right way. Our president is not a king, and our Constitution allocates the powers of the purse to the legislature for that very reason. If this is done the wrong way, it opens the door for tyranny and authoritarianism out of our federal government. And that is not the federal government that our founding fathers intended for this country when they wrote the Constitution. What do you think about the National Emergencies Act? Do you think we should be using it, or do you agree that this would be a dangerous precedent and could be used the wrong way in the future? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comments section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at EdsBlog Twitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care.